Okay, colleagues. So I wanted to do something different today. Um, More specifically, I wanted to look at this article from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The article is about ancient ethical theory by Richard Parry. And um, I think I'm going to mostly read the article out loud. Uh, I find it fairly useful, to proceed that way. And as I go along, I'll make some comments on it. I sort of use this article as a certain as a way to structure my thoughts on the ancient Greeks. And also, for many of you, this will be a chance to look at what proper academic articles on ancient Greeks look like. It's a fairly new article, so written in 2004 but revised in 2014. There's another article like this, a similar article on ancient political theory. In general, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a wonderful, wonderful resource. I cannot recommend it enough. It's sometimes difficult to read, but in general offers excellent material. So anyway, well, let's begin. So, while moral theory does not invent morality or even reflection on it, it does try to bring systematic thinking to bear on the phenomenon. So, moral theory, moral philosophy does not invent morality. People have thought about moral and political issues before they started philosophizing. But again, the difference between traditional values and philosophical approach is this, attempt to bring systematic thinking to bear on the phenomenon. Anyway, ancient moral theory, however, does not attempt to be a comprehensive account of all the phenomena that fall under the heading of morality. Rather, assuming piecemeal options and practices, it tries to capture the underlying essence of morality. It is the nature of such an enterprise to evaluate and criticize some of these opinions and practices, but that is not its primary goal. Ancient moral theory tries to provide a reflective account of an essential human activity so one can grasp what is of fundamental importance in pursuing it. In historical order, the theories to be considered in this article are those of Socrates as presented in certain dialogues of Plato. Notice, the author does not say in the early dialogues of Plato. This is tendentious and controversial. But certainly, there's a set of dialogues of Plato that seem to be shorter, that seem to be unified, that seem to have a kind of a unity of purpose and style. And some scholars tend to call them early dialogues. Here, again, views of Socrates as presented in certain dialogues of Plato. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy refers to them as Plato's shorter ethical works. Anyway, so first is Socrates. Second, Plato in the Republic. Notice Plato in the Republic, not let's say Plato in the Laws. There's evolution there. By the way, obviously, I grossly misspoke yesterday. It's a slip of tongue. No way did I mean to imply that Plato was influenced by Aristotle. Aristotle's much younger than Plato. I don't think there's any reason to suppose that Aristotle had any influence on Plato. I think it's imaginable in the realm of science fiction, but there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that. However, in general, there is a shift of later Plato towards this closer analysis, closer attention to social, empirical, historical scholarship, sort of, again, basing political theory more on observations of actually existing cities, again, which is what Plato does in his later work called The Laws. And in doing so, Plato anticipates Aristotelian method. So, well, anyway, let me continue. So again, Socrates, then Plato in the Republic. So Socrates in the earlier dialogues, shorter dialogues of Plato. Plato in the Republic, then Aristotle. And I'm going to finish with Aristotle today. This is as far as we're going to go. In general, maybe we'll continue next time because we will talk about the Cynics. Saronic hedonism is less important, I think, for our purposes, but it's good to keep in mind. But Cynics are definitely very important. Epicureans are crucially important, I think. Stoics as well, especially as the originators of the natural law tradition. And the Pyrrhonian skeptics, well, I have a special weakness for Pyrrhonian skeptics. I tend to think that Sextus Empiricus is my favorite philosopher among the ancients. I think that if I had to engage in a dialogue, if I had to talk to somebody, Plato would be an obvious first choice. But Sextus, yeah, it's like I would prefer to stay at the house of Sextus and then during the day go talk to go talk to Plato. I would prefer to have Sextus on my team, but talk to Plato, something like that. I don't know. It's fun thing to think about. Anyway, so but let's continue. Let's continue, and we're going to get to the meat of the discussion in a second. Gist of the discussion. So introduction. In the moral theories, the ancient philosophers depended on several important notions. These include virtue and the virtues, happiness. The Greek word is eudaimonia or eudaimonia, and the soul. We can begin with virtue. Virtue is a general term that translates the Greek word arete. Okay, so this is immediately complicated, right? So virtue is a word that has biblical connotations in English. It's actually hard to translate into Russian because, one possible translation I think is благочестие. Or добродетель. These are not the words that first-year students use. So I think it's best if we concentrate on this word arete. For the Greeks, this was not a technical term. This was a term of everyday language, but the connotations are quite different. So I think it's it's unfortunate that we have to use a technical term in place of a colloquial term that the Greeks used, but there's distance between our cultures and theirs, so sometimes we have to resort to that. Anyway, sometimes arete is also translated as excellence. So excellence, I think, is usually a better translation. Many objects, natural or artificial, have their particular arete or a kind of excellence. There's an excellence of a horse. So we understand. This is an excellent horse. This seems to be a clearer example, right? Or an excellence of a knife. And then, of course, there is human excellence. See, this is where it gets problematic. And again, especially when we're going to talk about these ideas and terms coined by Isaiah Berlin of positive and negative freedom, it seems that, again, within the traditions of negative freedom or negative liberty associated particularly with the liberal or libertarian traditions today, there's this notion that it's distasteful or it's it's not politically correct to talk about the human excellence because there are different humans, they have different values, and they can choose for themselves what is their excellence. Again, the ancient Greeks have this very strong assumption that there is a kind of a human nature and there is a proper excellence of a human being, and it can be known, right? And this is an assumption that the Greeks have, and this is an assumption that I think is mostly going to be shared by philosophers, later philosophers we're going to talk about, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and I think also very importantly Karl Marx relies on a certain idea of human nature. Human nature which is malleable and socially determined or socially constructed, but still certain parameters of human nature that Marx is going to talk about when underlying his ideas of communism. And I tried to talk about that yesterday when we talked about Aristotle. So conceptions of human excellence include such disparate figures as the Homeric warrior chieftain and the Athenian statesman of the period of imperial expansion. So very different visions of human excellence, right? So a warrior hero in Homer, like Achilles, who's rampaging through the battlefield, or an Athenian statesman of the period of imperial expansion. So somebody like Themistocles, or maybe Pericles, or Alcibiades. Anyway, so Plato's character. So in Plato's dialogue, Meno, the character, sums up one important strain of thought when he says that excellence for a man is managing the business of the city so that he benefits his friends, harms his enemies, and comes to no harm himself. I think this is an excellent definition, and in a certain preliminary fashion, I want to insist. I think it's a good definition. I think it's a good starting definition for us. Don't we all want to be excellent human beings? Don't we want to manage the business of the city or of the state or of our household well, so that to benefit our friends, harm our enemies, and come to no harm ourselves? Again, I'm not saying everybody automatically agrees. Can think of some exceptions, but in general, this seems to be a fairly middle-of-the-road position. A lot of people would find this tautological, I think, today. However, remember, in Plato's Republic and elsewhere, Socrates always asks this question. Okay, it's fine. You want to benefit your city, you want to harm your enemies, come to no harm yourself. But what is benefit? What is harm? How do you know if your city is actually your home and How do you know that your city has your best interests in mind? And you know, how do you know who are your friends and who are your enemies? I think these are all important, deeply important questions. Okay, so and again, I'm not saying that Mino is wrong. I'm saying that Mino's account has to be supplemented, or the sophistic account of Thrasymachus has to be supplemented by a theory of human nature, theory of human societies, right? And this is why we do philosophy. This is why, you know, from this perspective, philosophy is the most important enterprise, the overriding activity that human beings can engage in. Anyway, from this description, we can see that some versions of human excellence have a problematic relation to moral virtues. In the ancient world, courage, moderation, and justice were prime species of moral virtue. A virtue is a settled disposition to act in a certain way. This is very interesting. So again, within the ancient moral theory, virtue, or this arete or excellence, is usually associated with this idea of a settled disposition, like you can count on a certain person to act in a particular way, maybe even, if you want, in a habitual fashion, something of a habitual fashion. And again, I think there's, you know, especially in the Abrahamic traditions, there's this notion that actually a virtuous person has to overcome the temptation, has to overcome the sinfulness of human nature, and, you know, sort of you have a temptation to do something which you think is wrong, maybe steal or something like that, right? And you have to resist, actively resist this temptation, and this is supposed to be good. Now, this is not what the ancient philosophy is talking about, at least the way it's presented in this article by Richard Parry, right? A virtue is a settled disposition. You know, a good person is not the one who has to struggle with themselves to bring themselves to do the right thing. No, a good person is the one who does the right thing habitually, if you want, instinctively or automatically. This is why moral upbringing is so important. This is why, again, Plato talks about, you know, censorship and the noble lie, and a lot of students expressed concerns over these seemingly totalitarian elements in Plato. But you know, I want to remind everyone that sort of, if you look outside the window, if you look around, all of the societies known to me do practice quite a lot of censorship, and quite a lot of, you know, quote unquote, broadly speaking, noble lying. I mean, do we, especially again in terms of upbringing, what do we say to the children? Anyway, you know, in fact, you know, these ideas that we are discussing in this course, questions of whether patriotism is a good thing, you know, all these potentially subversive issues, like, right? Socrates, remember, is accused of corrupting the young. Wouldn't many of your parents accuse me of corrupting the young? I always ask this question, and if they would, doesn't this show that we still live with a kind of censorship? Again, Plato thinks that it should be the expert rulers with a knowledge of the forms who decide what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. We have different procedures today, but, you know, I think it's a question of degree. Like, it seems that most societies today agree with Plato that there should be censorship, and then the question is how much, why, and what should we censor? Complicated question. We'll get to John Stuart Mill at some point, who's the ultimate champion of freedom of speech, and John Stuart Mill is going to try to make the strongest possible case for unrestricted free speech. But I think even John Stuart Mill will point to a lot of examples where he thinks censorship is appropriate. The immediate example being children, again, and again, it depends on where does childhood end. You know, where does childhood end? Are we talking about 15 years of age, 16 years of age, 18 years of age, 21? Who knows? You know, prefrontal cortex. My neuroscientist friends tell me, you know, again, prefrontal cortex finishes its development by the age of 25. Again, do I mean to imply something in particular? No. I'm just asking questions. Let's go back to the article, but hopefully this gives you some food for thought. Okay, so we're talking about virtue as a settled disposition to act in a certain way. Justice, for instance, is the settled disposition to act, let's say, so that each one receives their due. This settled disposition includes a practical knowledge about how to bring it about in each situation, that each receives their due. Knowledge, right? It also includes a strong positive attitude towards bringing it about, that each receives their due. Just people, then, are not ones who occasionally act justly, or even who regularly act justly but out of some sort of other motive. Rather, just people are just people are just who reliably act in a just way because they place a positive, high intrinsic value on rendering to each their due, and they are good at it. Again, we'll talk about this, or we have already talked about this with respect to Plato. Again, Plato in the Republic, or Socrates in the Republic, tries to defend justice for its own sake, the value of the life of justice for its own sake, regardless of any other motive, regardless of any benefit, especially good reputation that it may bring. Anyway, courage is a settled disposition that allows one to act reliably, to pursue right ends in fearful situations, because one values acting so intrinsically. Moderation is the virtue that deals similarly with one's appetites and emotions. Human excellence can be conceived in ways that do not include the moral virtues. For instance, someone thought of as excellent for benefiting friends and harming enemies can be cruel, arbitrary, rapacious, and ravenous of appetite. So excellence can be conceived in ways that do not include the moral virtues. Again, it seems that in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Odysseus is presented as an excellent individual, among other things, because he's an excellent liar, and also because he's an excellent pirate. Okay, back to the article. So most ancient philosophers, however, argue that human excellence must include the moral virtues, that the excellent human will be, above all, courageous, moderate, and just. So most ancient philosophers, however, assume that excellence will include courage, moderation, and justice. This argument depends on making a link between the moral virtues and happiness. This is going to be very important. So a link between the moral virtues and happiness. Again, this is something for us to constantly keep in mind. Again, this idea of does Plato want people to sacrifice their interests for the sake of the state? And it seems preliminarily, to me at least, the answer always has to be no, because for the ancient moral theory, again, it seems that you have this idea that a proper excellence of a human being is in a deep sense identical, I'm even tempted to say identical to happiness. To be an excellent human and to be a happy human seems to go hand in hand. Again, we're talking about individual happiness, right? And we're going to talk about this later on, I'm sure, but it's like Socrates, I think, implies that doing the wrong thing, I mean, for example, him escaping his prison cell, as Crito suggests he does, this would make him less happy than he were if he drank poison. And that's why he chooses to drink poison. And this is an example that we're going to be keep coming back to when John Stuart Mill talks about utilitarianism and talks about how people are guided by pleasure and pain. The example, not the example that Mill gives, but the example that I give explaining Mill, is that a good firefighter would prefer to risk his or her life rather than face the shame. So it is less painful, more pleasurable, but ultimately less painful for a firefighter to risk their life rather than to live in shame. Anyway, so back to the text. While most ancient philosophers hold that happiness is the proper goal or end of human life, the notion is both simple and complicated, as Aristotle points out. It seems simple to say that everyone wants to be happy. It is complicated to say what happiness is. We can approach the problem by discussing first the relationship of happiness to human excellence, and then the relationship of human excellence to the moral virtues. Okay, let me try to maybe increase the font size a bit, especially if people are going to watch this on YouTube. Okay. So it is significant that synonyms for eudaimonia or eudaimonia are living well and doing well. Living well and doing well. These phrases imply certain activities associated with human living. Activities. This is going to be important in a second. Ancient philosophers argued that whatever activities constitute human living, for example, those associated with fear, one can engage in those activities in a mediocre or even a poor way. One can feel fear and react to dangerous situations, sometimes appropriately and sometimes inappropriately, or one might always act shamefully and dishonorably. However, to carry out these activities that constitute human living well over a whole lifetime or long stretches of it is living well or doing well. Aha. So living well over a whole lifetime. This is again another assumption that not everybody agrees with, but this seems to be an important assumption between ancient ethical theory. Again, that happiness is a characterization of life lived as a whole. Life as a whole can be said to be happy or not. Let me digress just for 1 second. There's a very famous story that Herodotus tells about the wise sage Solon visiting Croesus, the king of Lydia. And Croesus, who's extremely wealthy and powerful, a tyrant of Lydia, asks Solon, he shows Solon around the palace, and he asks Solon, tell me, who do you think is the happiest man alive? And it's very clear that Solon expects, that Croesus expects Solon to say, you, Croesus, you are the happiest man alive. And Solon says, Croesus, it's hard. Well, it's hard to say. You're not dead yet. You're not dead yet. I want to see how your story ends. Actually, according to the story, according to Herodotus, Croesus actually undergoes a reversal of fortune. I'm not going to spoil the story. It's an interesting story, but terrible things happen to Croesus. But in the end, he learns a bit of wisdom and becomes more humble and more moderate in his appetites. Anyway. So this idea that happiness, again, is related to an activity. So happiness is not just a feeling of pleasure, but it is, again, activity, like life lived well, not experiencing a lot of pleasure, but saying, I have lived a good life over my lifetime. I've had a life worth living. Anyway, so at this point, the relation of happiness to human excellence should be clear. Human excellence is the psychological basis for carrying out the activities of a human life. Carrying out the activities well. To that extent, human excellence is also happiness. Human excellence is also happiness. While the unhappy person deals with a vital and dynamic emotion like fear in an inept, unskillful way, the happy person handles fear skillfully and thereby exhibits human excellence. So described, human excellence is general and covers many activities of a human life. However, one can see how human excellence might at least include the moral virtues. The moral virtue relevant to fear, for instance, is courage. Courage is a reliable disposition to react to fear in an appropriate way. What counts as appropriate entails harnessing fear for good or honorable ends. Such ends are not confined to one's own welfare, but include, for example, the welfare of one's city. This way, moral virtues become a kind of human excellence that is other-regarding. The moral virtues, then, are excellent qualities of character, intrinsically valuable for the one who has them, but they are also valuable for others. So valuable for the ones who have them, but also valuable for others. And I think, like in a nutshell, think back to this positive idea of freedom, that ultimately, at the end of the day, the interests of the individual and the interests of society or of the polis coincide. So again, being an excellent individual is valuable for you, but it's also valuable for others. Again, an idea we'll keep coming back to over and over and over again in Rousseau, in Hegel, and Marx, but also in John Stuart Mill. In rough outline, we can see one important way ancient moral theory tries to link happiness to moral virtue by way of human excellence. Happiness derives from human excellence. Human excellence includes the moral virtues, which are implicitly or explicitly other-regarding. Since happiness plays such a vital role in ancient moral theory, we should note the difference between the Greek word eudaimonia and its usual translation as happiness. Although its usage varies, most often the English word happiness refers to a feeling. See, this is the difference. Eudaimonia is not a feeling. Happiness in everyday English usually refers to a feeling. For example, we say, you can tell he feels happy right now from the way he looks and how he is behaving. The feeling is described as one of contentment or satisfaction, perhaps with one's way of life as a whole is going. Sorry, I botched that phrase. So the feeling is described as one of contentment or satisfaction. So contentment with the way one's life as a whole is going. While some think there's a distinction between feeling happy and feeling content, still happiness is a good and pleasant feeling. However, happiness has a secondary sense that does not so in English, happiness has a secondary sense that does not focus on feelings, but rather on activities. Again, so not feelings, but rather on activities. For instance, one might say, it was a happy time in my life. My work was going well. The speaker need not be referring to the feelings he or she was experiencing, but just to the fact that some important activity was going well. Of course, if their work is going well, they might feel contentment, but in speaking of happiness, they might just as well be referring to their absorption in some successful activity. For ancient philosophers, eudaimonia is closer to the secondary sense of our term. Happiness means not so much feeling a certain way or feeling a certain way about how one's life as a whole is going, but rather carrying out certain activities or functioning in a certain way. Again, I'm always deeply uncomfortable giving biographical examples, but think about today. Today is a holiday. We have a day off. What am I doing? I am recording this for YouTube because, you know, it makes my day worthwhile. I could do something else. I don't know, eat a bowl of ice cream or just, watch a movie, and it would make me feel good, sort of inject dopamine into my brain, make me feel, or serotonin maybe, make me feel pleasure. But you see, again, feeling pleasure and feeling that you're doing something worthwhile, I think are different. And this is the insight of ancient Greek philosophy, which I think is still valid today. I mean, if you look at the way, I mean, this is a strange example to give, but still, if you look, in the way that people struggle with, so many people struggle with depression today, and the kinds of advice, self-help advice that people are giving, I'm one immediate, not necessarily the deepest thinker of our time, but the one who is rather popular, Mark Manson. I think twice on the New York bestseller list. Mark Manson talks about how, in order to be happy, in order to, feel contentment with your life as a whole, you need to be engaged in activity. You need to try to realize goals which are larger than yourself. That there is a certain emptiness in pleasure for the sake of pleasure. And again, it's a controversial point. Of course, people will disagree. But again, these are the insights of the ancient Greek philosophers. It's a strong assumption. I think it is not. It is not an unrealistic assumption. So I find this assumption deeply plausible. And this is an assumption, again, that many philosophers of positive freedom, like Rousseau, Hegel, Marx, but also Mill, with his emphasis on higher pleasures. So this is an assumption that many of modern philosophers will share. Anyway, so in this way, then ancient philosophers typically justify moral virtue. Being courageous, just, and moderate is valuable for the virtuous person because these virtues are inextricably linked with happiness. Everyone wants to be happy, so anyone who realizes the link between virtue and happiness will also want to be virtuous. Again, you have this intrinsic motivation. Everybody wants to be happy. We need to get to the story of the Ring of Gyges at some point, because again, I owe you today an account of why would you want to be quote-unquote virtuous even if you had a ring of invisibility. Again, I'm saying to a large extent tempted to go back to Mark Manson. Again, this, to some extent, this is already what I'm talking about. Like, if I had a ring of invisibility, like, you are not looking at me right now. I have a day off. I might as well have a ring of invisibility. I could do all sorts of things with my life. But what I choose to do, the things that I find deeply worthwhile, again, this is not a class. I don't have to be here. And you, presumably watching this, you also don't have to be here. Nobody's taking your attendance, right? But we are doing this presumably because we enjoy it, because it fulfills us as human beings. And it's like, I'll keep coming back to this thought, but I think an important idea is that obviously you need a certain level of material prosperity. Like, if you are starving or if you don't have roof over your head, this makes your life miserable. Unless you are Diogenes, which takes training and also, I think, maybe a certain luck in terms of, being born with a particular character. But still, so I'm not saying that material possessions are unimportant, but sort of once you have a basic level of material possessions, I feel that like the really important, really worthwhile things in life cannot be bought. The important, valuable things in life don't cost money. They take time, they take effort, but they don't cost money. Things that make our life deeply meaningful, it seems, be it, the private goods, engaging with your family, engaging with your friends. This does not cost money. It costs effort and time, but not necessarily money. Being a good father or a good wife or a good mother or a good sister or brother, right? Likewise, being a good friend, on the one hand. And on the other hand, if you think of public virtues, public activities like writing a book, or participating in politics. Very few people have this experience today, but if you think back to Aristotle's ruling and being ruled, in a limited fashion, I think we can experience this if ever you are called to be a jury, to be a member of a jury in a court of law. Being a good juror does not cost money, but it costs, again, time and effort. So these are the limiting factors. And what I'm driving at is that ring of invisibility does nothing for this. Ring of invisibility does not really help you become a good friend or a good family member, a good brother or a good son or daughter. It doesn't help you to be a good juror, it seems to me. And again, I mentioned this yesterday. My neuroscientist friends and my psychologist friends tell me that even if you had a ring of invisibility, most people would be deeply uncomfortable just going around stealing, raping and murdering other people. It would make us feel like we are not those kinds of people. There is a human nature. Again, it's I don't expect you to believe me. This is a very strong claim, but again, I think that contemporary psychology seems to point, or not just psychology, but also evolutionary science and evolutionary psychology seems to point in that direction. But that's a separate discussion. Let's go back to the ancient Greeks. I digress. Anyway, so now where was I? Anyway, so in this way, then, ancient philosophers typically justify moral virtue. Being courageous, just and moderate, is valuable for the virtuous person because these virtues are inextricably linked with happiness. Everyone wants to be happy, so anyone who realizes the link between virtue and happiness will also want to be virtuous. This argument depends on two central ideas. First, human excellence is the good of the soul, not a material or bodily good, such as wealth or political power. Another way to put this idea is to say that happiness is not something external, like wealth or political power, but an internal psychological good. And I'm tempted to think about John Stuart Mill and his notion of higher and lower pleasures. Lower pleasures being mostly pleasures of the body, and to a large extent depending on the external wealth or political power, but higher pleasures have this internal psychological character. Life as a work of art, an important idea for so many philosophers. Human life, crafting your own life as a work of art, in Nietzsche, in John Stuart Mill, in Michel Foucault, in so many others. Anyway, the second central idea is that most important good of the soul is moral virtue. By being virtuous, one enjoys a psychological state whose value outweighs whatever other kinds of goods one might have by being vicious. I keep referring to Mill. Whenever I read Mill, I always am constantly reminded of these ancient contexts that we're talking about right now. Anybody who's writing or planning to write about Mill on the University of London exam, I invite you to pay attention to this stuff. Anyway, finally, a few words about the soul are in order, since typically philosophers argue that virtue is a good of the soul. In some ways, this claim is found in many traditions. Many thinkers argue that being moral does not necessarily provide physical beauty, health, or prosperity. Rather, as something good, virtue must be understood as belonging to the soul. When we say soul, you could say, since most modern people, I would take it, don't believe in the soul, you could say psyche, your psychology, right? My OBS tells me that I have connection problems. Okay, apologies. As soon as I can hear myself. My OBS tells me. Oh, okay, and it seems we're back. Okay, apologies. Okay. Yeah. So finally, a few words about the soul in order. So virtue must be understood as belonging to the soul. It is a psychological good. However, in order to explain virtue as a good of the soul, one does not have to hold that soul is immortal. In fact, this is one reason I am not a fan of medieval political theory, because of their reliance on religious dogma, and especially on this idea of immortality of the soul. Because, I think that, again, controversial assertion, everything in philosophy is controversial, but I think from standpoint of contemporary scientific outlook, and contemporary philosophical outlook, including philosophy of science and philosophical naturalism, the idea that soul is immortal is deeply implausible. It's a deeply implausible idea. And again, many ancient philosophers also considered the immortality of the soul to not be a settled truth, right? So Aristotle does not seem to count on the immortality of the soul. Epicurus specifically opposes the immortality of the soul. And Socrates in Plato's Apology explicitly says we don't know what happens to us after we die. Maybe there is an afterlife, or maybe it's like a dreamless sleep, total nothingness, annihilation, extinction. So I think, since we don't know what's going to happen to us after we die, we'd better make decisions. Since we don't know that for sure, for certain, we'd better make decisions based on what happens to us in this life. And, que sera, sera. What happens after we're dead, let's worry about it then. But right now, we have to focus on this life. It's kind of the philosophy of this worldly activity. Anyway, in order to explain virtue as the good of the soul, one does not have to hold that the soul is immortal. So this is going to be very important. While Plato, for example, holds that the soul is immortal and that its virtue is a good that transcends death, his argument for virtue as a psychological good does not depend on the immortality of the soul. So again, Aristotle believes that soul is immortal. Aristotle seems to not believe that the soul is immortal. Plato does, but his argument for the moral virtue does not depend on the immortality of the soul. Plato argues that virtue is a psychological good in this life. To live a mortal human life with this good is in itself happiness. This position that links happiness and virtue is called eudaimonism. So again, an important word for our purposes. It's not going to be on the exam because it's not part of your reading, but an important word, I think, for our intellectual development. This again, so happiness and linking this happiness and virtue is referred to in the ancient Greek context as eudaimonism. Eudaimonia, a word based on the principal Greek word for happiness, eudaimonia. By eudaimonism, we mean that one of the several theses. A, virtue together with its active exercise is identical with happiness. B, virtue together with its activities is the most important and dominant. Should I increase this some more, I wonder? Virtue together with its activities is the most important and dominant constituent of happiness. Or C, virtue is the only means to happiness. Virtue is the only means to happiness. However, one must be cautious not to conclude that ancient theories in general attempt to construe the value of virtue simply as a means to achieving happiness. Each theory, as we shall see, has its own approach to the nature of the link between virtue and happiness. It would not be advisable to see ancient theories as concerned with such contemporary issues as whether moral discourse, i.e., in other words, discourse about what one ought to do, can or should be reduced to non-moral discourse. In other words, to discourse about what is good for one. So again, notice, for us, it seems for us today, it seems to be a natural assumption that everybody should try to be happy in life. That sort of virtue is valuable because it leads to happiness. This would be our natural assumption. For the ancients, not necessarily so. For the ancients, especially for the Stoics, they would say that virtue is sufficient. Virtue is more important than happiness. This sounds strange and paradoxical to us. Now, I have to tell you that from the standpoint of critical philosophy, I think this view is deeply suspect, because if you're doing something not for the sake of your own happiness, but for the sake of something else, how do you know that you are not being misled, mistaken, or being lied to? So I personally find this dangerous, this idea that if you define goodness or justice irrespectively, right? If you divorce it, detach it from considerations of personal happiness, with Callicles and Thrasymachus, I am then prone to ask, but how do I know that this is what I really should be doing? So at the end of the day, I feel a certain deep commitment, and some of the ancient philosophers also have this commitment. Epicurus, for example. I feel this deep commitment to the internal, intrinsic, immanent criterion of rightness or wrongness. If you are doing something right, it should feel right. Maybe in this, again, not necessarily in terms of this straightforward pleasure. Again, I'm doing this right now, not because it gives me more pleasure than watching cartoons or eating ice cream, but because I find it more worthwhile. But for me, my decision to record this video right now is a matter of intrinsic motivation. It's not because I have faith in some external, quote-unquote, sacred book. Sacred considered, sacred according to whom? If you employ transcendent standard, like the, let's say, divine command theory of justice, divine command theory of morality, if you employ a transcendent standard, immediately you run into an epistemological problem. How do we know that this is the right standard? Again, this is my view, okay? My own personal subjective view. You don't. I'm not inviting you to agree with it. I'm just throwing it out there as a discussion starter. Anyway, so let's go back to the article. It would not be advisable to see ancient theories as concerned with such contemporary issues. Yeah. So these reflections on virtue can provide an occasion for contrasting ancient moral theory and modern. One way to put the contrast is to say that ancient moral theory is agent-centered, while modern moral theory is action-centered. To say that ancient theory is action-centered means that as a theory of morality, it explains morality to begin with in terms of actions and their circumstances. Sorry, modern theory is ancient-centered. So to say that modern moral theory is action-centered means that as a theory of morality, modern theory of morality explains moral action in terms of actions and their circumstances, and the ways in which actions are moral or immoral. We can roughly divide modern thinkers, into two groups. Those who judge morality of an action on the basis of its known or expected consequences are called consequentialists. The most famous of these would be John Stuart Mill, but also David Hume, but also, I think, Thomas Hobbes. Those who judge morality of an action on the basis of its conformity to certain kinds of laws, prohibitions, or positive commandments are deontologists, from the Greek word deon, which means duty. So again, we talk about consequentialists and deontologists. The former include, for example, utilitarians, who say an action is moral if it provides the greatest good for the greatest number. I'm going to talk about this in detail. Deontologists say, for example, Kant, that an action is moral if it conforms to a moral principle, for example, obligation to tell the truth. While these thinkers are not uninterested in the moral disposition to produce such actions, or in what disposition is required if they are to show any moral worth in the persons who do them, their focus, so the focus of modern theories, is on actions, their consequences, and the rules or other principles to which they conform. The result of these ways of approaching morality is that moral assessment falls on actions. This focus explains, for instance, contemporary fascination with such questions of casuistry as, for example, the conditions under which an action like abortion is morally permitted or immoral. Trolley problem. I have to tell you, I am deeply allergic to the trolley problem. Okay, for precisely this reason, that this casuistic, legalistic questions. In this sense, I express my allegiance to the ancient moral theory. I think virtue of character is much more worthwhile question than what should you do in the case of the trolley problem. I don't want to comment on this, but sort of I think if we think about this seriously, it's like if you end up in such a horrible situation as the trolley problem pertains, you'd just be in shock. You would just do whatever. I feel that this is such a distortion of view to concentrate on these extremely convoluted examples that have such little such little resemblance to real life. I mean, when was the last time you had to solve a dilemma like a trolley problem? I'm again reminded. You see again, Plato, Socrates, when he talks to Cephalus, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus, especially to Cephalus, he's not talking about these examples of a trolley problem. What he has in mind is that most people just live their lives according to prejudice of their culture. What Hannah Arendt calls banality of evil. You're simply following the normal course of affairs, and as a person myself sympathetic to Marxism, I think that so many issues of justice or in general morality just simply we never bring them into focus because we are in a grip of an ideology, and this is why I find the trolley problem not just I want to say distasteful, limiting, but also I see a sinister side to the trolley problem. I think it obscures a whole host of issues which are of much bigger importance. So in some sense, I think that the trolley problem is a way of doing sterile, impotent moral philosophy. Doing moral philosophy in impotent and a sterile fashion. Talk about these convoluted examples instead of really examining our lives. Escaping this quest for self-examination that Socrates is talking about by focusing on these puzzle-like examples. Anyway, apologies. Yes, you can sense bitterness in my voice. Maybe this is not pedagogical. Again, I invite you to take my words with a grain of salt. I am allergic to trolley problem. I'm not the best person to explain its significance. Anyway, let's continue. By contrast, ancient moral theory explains morality in terms that focus on the moral agent. These thinkers are interested in what constitutes, for example, a just person. They are concerned about the state of mind and character, the set of values, the attitudes to oneself and to others, and the conception of one's own place in the common life of a community that belong to just persons simply as so far as they are just. A modern might object that this way of proceeding is backwards. Just actions are logically prior to just persons and must be specifiable in advance of any account of what it is to be a just person. Of course, the ancients had a rough idea of what just actions were. And this rough idea certainly contributed to the notion of a just person and his motivation and system of values. Still, the notion of a just person is not exhausted by an account of the consequences of just actions or any principle for determining which actions are and which actions are not just. For the ancients, the just person is compared to a craftsman, for example, a physician, so a doctor. Acting as a doctor, as a physician, is not simply a collection of medically effective actions. It is knowing when such actions are appropriate, among other things, and this kind of knowledge is not always definable. To understand what being a physician means, one must turn to the physician's judgment and even motivation. These are manifested in particular actions, but are not reducible to those actions. So again, a good physician is not just somebody who occasionally engages in the correct medical practices. It's a person with a with a certain background, habits, with certain dispositions, and a right kind of motivation. A good physician is a person who values the health of their patients for its own sake, it seems. Anyway, so in the same way, what constitutes a just person is not exhausted by the actions he or she does, nor, for that matter, by any catalog of possible just actions. Rather, being a just person entails qualities of character proper to the just person, in the light of which they decide what actions justice requires of them. Okay, so this has been going on for quite some time. I wonder if maybe I should take a break and then we'll continue with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Okay. Let's pause here. But again, as always, I hope that this is